Yeah, so could I, but I don't have time for that. All right, so let us see. Okay. Oh, that's why. That's why. Okay, yeah, the Wammen question. Yeah, the USS Lena Sutcliffe Higbee DDG 123 is named after Chief Nurse Lena H. Sutcliffe Higbee, a pioneering Navy nurse who served as superintendent of the U.S. Navy Nurse Corps during World War One. So that's the reason why. Because it's a Wammen. It's a Wammen ship. Like, why would you make a shooter into a Wammen named ship? Like, and especially because she's not even in a combat arms MOS. Like, just why? Like, why? Oh, I know why. Because regime reasons, ideological regime reasons. It has to be named after a Wammen. Oy.
Exactly. Yeah. There can be nothing named after old America. Uh,
Well, I mean, she is old America, but like it's always through the lens of intersectionality, right? Um. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's Jeremiah Denton. That's not surprising. Let's see what else. Okay, yeah. Well, hello everybody. We are back. I should probably, since we got people watching now. Um, yes, we are back. We are live. I have with me American Elitist, and we are going to have us a question and an interview session about military life. I have with me American Elitist, formerly known as American Populist, who wants to perform an interview. So before we get started, let's go ahead and get our quick shills out of the way. Everybody knows who I am. I am Raging Mandrill, also known as Raging Monkey on Twitter. I did a name change as well, but short for RM. And you can find me on the usual places: Gab, Telegram, Twitter, obviously here on my YouTube channel, and as well as on my Substack. And I do work for the Old Glory Club as well, so be sure to check out all those places. AE, go ahead and get your shills out of the way, please.
so I was formerly called AP. I ditched that name because populism is retarded. It was getting old anyway. So, but you can still find me under that name. The YouTube channel is now called American Elitist. Same channel, just different name. You can check out my content there. I do great interviews with people in the sphere who are high IQ. Only the best content gets on there. You can also find me on Twitter under that name as well. So if you guys want to check me out, you can follow me on those platforms.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So, like we were saying, we were engaging in ship autism, and of course, we have a bunch of um, Navy destroyers that we were looking up the names for and seeing the background of the people who they were naming these things for. So yeah, let's see. Yeah. Okay, that's not surprising. Okay, yeah. So some of these guys are also former the more newer destroyers that they're making are so usually the way that it works in the Navy is that destroyers are named after people, cruisers are named after famous battles, um, and the uh, like the submarines, the nuclear submarines are named after states. Sometimes, occasionally, cities, but mostly states. The LCSs are usually named after cities, like famously, I think we've got USS Milwaukee and yeah, USS Minneapolis and things like that. Definitely USS Fort Worth, right? That famous LCS class, which I think is a Independence class, if I remember correctly. No, it's a Freedom class. Anyway, so we are here to answer questions regarding U.S. military life, and so yeah, go ahead and start asking questions. This is going to be kind of a casual stream. There's no real formal um, structure to this. We're just going to be rapid fire questions, and yeah.
All right. Well, I guess I just start a combat question. Do you
Okay.
think the Vietnam War was winnable from the American perspective?
Um, that's a good question. I would say that in general, if the military adage is shit in, shit out, if you want to put in the colorful expression. Um, oh, I probably should show this stream too before I forget on Twitter. Um, yeah. So I would say that yes, it was winnable if you like any military problem is winnable if you put in more resources, of course. And the problem with Vietnam is like with a lot of the oh sorry, there's a car alarm going off in the background. A lot of the problem with with just Vietnam and any sort of these like brush wars that the gay likes to engage in don't put in the resources, they don't put in the time, they the support for things over the long haul. And I imagine that's probably because of the democratic structure to a large degree. Um, but yeah, I think the Vietnam War was probably winnable if we put in more resources, even with like things like obvious foibles like McNamara's morons. Um, Even with like mass bombing campaigns in Cambodia on like VC networks and tunnels and shit like that, like all of that stuff is definitely possible. But if you fight that war, you don't fight it as an insurgency campaign, right? If you fight the war where you just mass manpower, what you got to do is basically you say, okay, you enlisted men, you are here. You are not just here to serve 1 year tour duty in Vietnam. You are here for a minimum of 2 years. Okay, so it ends up like any other regular tour of duty. So you're here for the long haul. You're not just trying to like do your time and get out before everything's over. It reduces less turnover in personnel, um, and you fight this to win, right? You don't try to fight Viet Cong in the jungle like you like firebomb Hanoi, essentially, is how you win, right? Um, and you fight it as conventional of a war as possible because even with Chinese and Soviet aid, that's the North Vietnamese just don't have the resources to go toe to toe with the American military in the 60s and 70s. It's just not possible. Um, so yeah, that's my take on Vietnam.
I definitely think it was a winnable war, but just the commitment and betrayal from the politicians, as usual, led to it being just a wasted conflict where we wasted tons of energy and blood and treasure for nothing in the end, and it was just all all just conquered in like what for how long it took the North to take the South, like 2 weeks or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean that's like when they mention things like when things collapse, they collapse slowly and then suddenly, right? The United States had really not been in Vietnam as a military force since 1973 after Nixon largely pulled us out. The real the real problem is that like we were trying you're trying to transition it from a United States backed like uh regime in Vietnam, which is already kind of a very weak regime, to be sure. Like the elites in Vietnam who ruled the country, like this is a famous talking point, even in like the Ken Burns documentary, which I've watched multiple times. The They like to say that okay, you have a high turnover in leadership in the Vietnamese political class themselves, and when you turn over the leadership to like lower and lower people down the chain, obviously this creates a lot of chaos and a lot of turmoil. So like this the situation in Vietnam politically, even in South Vietnam, was not like stable. They just didn't have a lot of support. So even with Western arms and Western money being poured in, it's and this is not to throw shade at like the Arvin because the Arvin like surprisingly did a halfway decent job while they were armed by the American military. Um, but this is a question of American political will, really, and you're trying to turn this from a conflict which has direct U.S. involvement into a proxy conflict. Um, that's a very difficult transition, and I'm not sure that you can do it. I think that that's basically, if you pull out, that's a massive demoralization for somebody who's fighting, right? And we've seen this in Afghanistan as well. If you're already involved, you can't de-involve yourself without just taking an L, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially because South Vietnam, unlike with Ukraine now, there isn't like a natural sort of division that exists between Vietnam, the North or the South. It was kind of just an artificial line created by Stalin and Churchill and FDR at like the Potsdam Conference or whatever. They decided to divide Asia. So I feel like that kind of plays a role, even though like obviously they weren't pro-communist. Like they're kind of the same people, so like there's a racial aspect to that, which is going to be
Mhm.
hard to like get them to be fully on board our side, and because a lot of them helped the enemy. And this was a big problem because a lot of them were spies and just handed over data and things like this. But that's a story for another time. With our allies, our greatest allies that we pick. Uh, I feel like the same thing applies to Korea though, because I feel like we could have won Korea as well if we just like nuked China essentially, but that was the only way that was possible. You think that we could have done that? There was the will.
I mean, hmm. That's the Korean question is a tough one, because also I think that you do have the political will to continue that conflict of anti-communism, and this is kind of where I think that we really should look into the mythology of the based 50s, because I mean, if the 50s were so based, okay, well, why didn't we just continue fighting, North Korea, and say, okay, well, fuck you, China, we're going to send you back above, the boundaries of the Korean nation, right? Which basically happened under MacArthur, and that was one of the big reasons why MacArthur got sacked, is because he went into China, and exceeded the North Korean territory, and then the Chinese decided to get involved, and then you know, um, basically the offensive that the Chinese made sent us, took almost the entire Korean peninsula back for the communists. But this is one of those weird historical anachronisms where it's like, okay, why? Um, I mean, if Korea was absolutely winnable if you had just not messed with China, basically. And like the issue with messing with China, especially, I remember when, I can't remember the exact date when the Soviets got the nuclear bomb. I think it was in 47 or 48, maybe 49. Anyway, it was the late 40s, and once you get to that point where the Soviets get the bomb, okay, now everybody has weapons of mass destruction, right? So it's not like, oh, I have this massive, overwhelming firepower sort of thing. And you also have to remember, like after World War II, in the late 40s, a lot of the military hardware got, like downsized. Even during Korea, um, which is an interesting, thing, because okay, you're also fighting a hot war with a communist state, and you're also kind of fighting it one hand behind your back. So yeah, I think that in terms of like the based 50s of anti-communism and that sort of thing, it's very clear that the United States against communism was never really truly fighting to win. Um, so
Yeah, MacArthur was willing to do what was necessary. If you kind of read what this guy was gonna do with China, and actually I read what the plan was, but it was like 7 or 8 nukes, just like to stop the Chinese hordes from coming in.
hmm.
Because we had people forget this, but we basically had all of North Korea under our control, and we were at the like Chinese
Yes,
border. We
yes,
were
and
winning
and
the war.
we actually went, like I said, we went, the U.S. military went into China, slightly, which is one of the reasons why the Chinese decided to invade, among other ideological reasons, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, of course, that's a later part of the conflict, right? It was like 1950, basically, when that happened. but these little proxy wars that the United States like to engage in because it doesn't actually like it to get involved with large scale conflicts, because it means that you have to do mass conscription, which hasn't been done in the United States since World War II. And two, having a volunteer army is very much like whatever problems are in the military, whatever like nonsense, like, and there's a lot of bullshit when you're in the military. You put up with a lot of bullshit, um, and in order to put up with the bullshit, well, what do the brass and the senior officers tell you? They tell you, well, you signed on the dotted line, and so you agreed to everything, right? Um, and this is a huge question because I've heard senior officers in my time in the service say this as well, when they are sympathetic to conscription, um, because if you have a conscript service, it means that if you get into a war, it's not just one segment of the population who is doing the fighting, it's everybody across the society. And so this weird sort of like, oh, well, we're still kind of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, but like nobody's really paying attention, right? That doesn't exist in a conscript army, right? Because it's everybody's across society in all regions are affected basically equally, to a large degree. And if you take casualties, right, it's not just, oh, well, it's on the dotted line, right? You signed up for this. No, you actually have, mothers who don't get a choice, who aren't military family or military related, in any possible way, who have to come to your doorstep as a senior officer, say, oh, my son died under your command, right? So there's a perception that there's a bit more, um, it's more authoritarian, obviously, but there's also kind of more accountability because it can't just be hand waved away in the same way that a volunteer military force can.
I feel like the other big problem with mass conscription army now is because we've been so degraded and declined so much. Is that I mean, I don't know if you ever seen that survey that the Ronald Reagan Society puts out or whatever. Like, how many young people, like the prime age 18 and like 26, are actually even like eligible to even serve in the military? It's like
Hmm.
6%
Hmm.
or less, and that number's only getting worse. It's been
Yeah.
declining precipitously.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And it's something to bear in mind that when it's funny, especially in the military, because there's definitely a residual honor culture that still exists, um, but it's very much in a way of achievement, right? So if somebody doesn't achieve a goal in the military, it is, oh, you are the worst possible person on earth. Everything is all your fault. Blah 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 blah. You're horrible. You're terrible, etc. Right? Um, you're the worst infantryman, the worst seaman, the worst officer, the worst chief or whatever. And so it always gets classified into that, right? Because if there's a mess up, it's always about accountability, and everything is always your fault from a leadership perspective, right? Um, but the problem with that is you have to remember these people are like the creme de la creme of personnel, right? These are people who, you have to get them through basic training, so they have to pass basic military requirements, right? In the case of many military people, like they actually have to be able to have like color vision, which a lot of people are colorblind. So you got to get through the medical screening part first. You have to pass the physical fitness requirements first. You have to be able to be motivated enough to get through the basic training. You have to be intelligent enough to get through the basic training to some degree. Um, you have to pass whatever basic instruction courses after basic training, right? Um, uh, and then, of course, like for example, in the Navy, you have to get warfare qualified, which means in addition, you have to get all of these like uh, qualification requirements that you have to get, and that's an additional knowledge set, and that takes you probably a year, maybe two. So, and that's on top of doing like an actual like full time job. So, yeah, the quality of personnel, like, even from the military, and even in today's degraded military state, um, it is still like fairly high. Like it's like 3% of the population. So from that perspective, yes, it is very much an elite.
And no, it very much is. It's just that that base is just declining rapidly more than they can be replenished. This is why they have to like recruit the bottom of the barrel stuff. I don't know if you've ever seen these like business insider documentaries where they basically go through boot camp. And like what they've done now is basically they have like new boot camp where you're not allowed to yell at people. And you can basically be fat. I mean, still get in because they just need numbers, basically.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen this. And you're kind of this is the problem with volunteer militaries, is because, and I think this is a latent problem that we haven't really seen before, because if you have a volunteer military where people still are extremely civically minded and want to serve because of patriotism, or because of, oh hey, I'm a ruralite American who comes from a small town with limited economic opportunities, and I want, to be able to fund my own undergraduate degree through the GI Bill or something like that. I mean, those are legitimate like ways of acquiring capital, and um, yeah, hmm, it's one of these things, man. Like, I don't know. It makes me sad, really, because you can't have a volunteer military if you don't have a population, and if you don't like have the trust of the population, right? Whereas if you do conscription, you don't need trust because you have the bureaucratic stick to throw at people, right? But then the opposite thing happens as well, because you know, yeah. Um, Oh, so I'm looking at the, speaking of military bases, we were talking before we went live about the renaming of military bases, and this is not something that's just in like army bases. This is also in terms of navy ships, right? So there's a cruiser which is called, or formerly known as, the USS Chancellorsville, which of course is a Confederate victory in the American Civil War, and they renamed it the USS Robert Smalls. And of course, this included a portrait of General Robert E. Lee and General Thomas Jackson in the cruiser's wardroom. That painting was removed in 2016. Yeah, I wonder why. And um, it also, the crest had an inverted wreath that commemorated the death of Jackson during the Battle of Chancellorsville. So, like, and this is a big deal too, because the Chancellorsville's crest, if you know anything about Navy culture, they wear the famous ball cap that you'll see on people's, like, the old version is like dungarees from like the 80s and 90s or early 2000s. But all of these ships have like caps that every single sailor wears, and that crest is going to be on the cap, right? So literally, why would they not want this to happen? Well, because obviously the left doesn't like the optics of having, you know, Stonewall's Jackson, being commemorated on the cap of brown people. And so let's see, who did they name this after? Oh, okay, so they named it after Robert Smalls, who apparently is a slave who commandeered the Confederate ship CSS Planter in 1862. Interesting. It says here, this is an interesting tidbit on Wikipedia. The Navy held a ceremony to mark the change that was designed not to disrupt the ship's activities. So yeah, they kind of did this quietly, you know. Um,
I feel like specifically though, since you're from the Navy, you can probably tell us like why, out of all branches, please go look at the Business Insider documentaries if you have it because it shows us very well. When you just look at Navy boot camp, it's just it seems like just like the worst quality people generally. I don't think that's offensive, but like all of these people are fat. Like when you look at the instructors, they're all fat. They all have a boiler, a double D boiler. They're all women. Uh, can you kind of explain why that is? What's going on with the Navy there? Because there's a lot of things about the Navy that stigmas, right?
Sure. Um, well, I mean, this is the old Winston Churchill line about the Royal Navy, which is, rum, sodomy, and the lash, and all that. Um, I won't comment on that part more than that, but the thing with the Navy, right, and why the Navy is probably so incredibly paused is because physical fitness requirements don't are just lower, right? You won't need to see that until wartime actually hits. And when was the last time the U.S. Navy actually fought a peer-to-peer adversary? Arguably in 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Um, which there's an excellent book, by the way, if anyone is interested in, which is called The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. So if you're looking for classic Americana, which even it's still kind of boomer truthy because it's World War II, but it's a very, very good book, and I'd highly recommend it. Which is a fascinating story because it's about destroyer escorts and destroyers going up against Japanese battleships and battle cruisers and somehow winning. Or
Or like
um,
Taffy 3 surviving for as long as he
yeah,
did.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know the story. Good. Um, yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because those are Taffy 3 was a bunch of they call them,
Fletcher class destroyers. Fletcher.
yeah, Fletcher class destroyers and destroyer escorts, right? So not even like a destroyer; it's just called a destroyer escort. And these ships were guarding in Task Force 3 a bunch of jeep carriers, right? Which of course jeep carriers are they're not even like they're miniature carriers, if that makes sense, but they're also kind of they're slower, so they're basically how should I describe them? They're a way of getting aircraft carriers on the cheap and quicker, and having a platform for launching aircraft that isn't actually a purpose-built aircraft carrier like you would think of, the old World War II USS Enterprise or that sort of thing, right? Um, yeah, and so and of course the jeep carriers are like slower, so they're trying to get away, and then Taffy through the destroyers basically have to like intercept the Japanese ships, and yeah,
I think it was the main battle squadron too, if I'm not
it
mistaken.
was
I could
it
be wrong
was
about that.
yeah, it was like a total BTFO too. So everybody gets an understanding of the tactical and operational picture for Leyte Gulf. The battle of the Surigao Strait is the like the add-on to Leyte Gulf. Like, so you have the Japanese force, which, if I remember correctly, did have the Yamato battleship as well as a couple other ones, and they were essentially steaming through this like relatively narrow island channel in between some Philippine islands, and then that was a distraction force, right? So when you see in the Surigao Strait, like, oh, there's this kind of like half-assed or extremely small Japanese battleship squadron looking thing that's going up the strait, and then they're just getting shelled to pieces by reconstructed um, American battleships that had been sunk 3 years earlier in Pearl Harbor, as well as like new North Carolina and Iowa class battleships. Like, that's the distraction for what the Japanese were trying to do, because what the Japanese were trying to do was trying to attack a they're using this operational maneuver where they're telegraphing that, oh, hey, I'm going to, and they're intentionally splitting up their fleet, and they're sending part of this fleet, the smaller part, in through the Surigao Strait as a distraction, so the Americans will think that the attack is coming to the south, Meanwhile, they're steaming around to the north, and they find the Taffy or Task Force 3, and you know, essentially the Jeep carriers, they do take hits, but like a Jeep carrier isn't actually a proper carrier, right? If that makes sense. The the Jeep carriers are like cheap, easily constructed, like put together, like it's basically a floating landing pad, if that makes sense, right? And it's constructed probably a lot of them like out of converted merchant ships or something like that, if I remember correctly. So they're not like design built aircraft carriers by any means. Um, but yeah, so they're a lot slower too. And yeah, the Japanese do get some hits onto these Jeep carriers, but like they don't sink any of them.
No, I believe the last actually carrier there ever sunk was the Battle of was it Coral Sea or something like that? It was a Jeep carrier. It wasn't even a full carrier. It was a kamikaze too. So
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Coral Sea is interesting because it's the lead up to Midway, and it's really overlooked because for a couple reasons. Because everybody looks at Midway because there's a movie about it. Everybody looks at Pearl Harbor because there's a movie about it. Like Tora 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 is an excellent movie, um, but the Coral Sea is important because the Japanese essentially had two carriers that got damaged, so they had to send them back to Japan for repair. And the Americans did have carriers that were also damaged, but essentially what it means is the Americans essentially like they get the USS Yorktown like repaired, um, ersatz repaired in time for Midway. And so the Japanese have only four carriers to send at Midway for their plan instead of the full six that they wanted. Um, and so, like, when the carriers at Midway get sunk, it's just basically over for them. Like, it, it's interesting because Midway supposedly was a battle that was won in the span of about 2 minutes. So yeah, it really is an example of everything is prep, right? If you're attacking, and of course the famous decision of the Japanese strike group commander, I forget what his name is. Shoot. But yeah, he made the decision to switch over from bombs into torpedoes, and that essentially cost him. Once the American fleet was detected by the Japanese, and that cost them the battle because it took too long.
no, but it kind of demonstrates competency of where we once were with the Navy. I feel like this is with all navies. All navies have been like neutered. They've just been neutered. And you see this with the Russians, like all European navies, they're pretty much non-existent. Uh, Old Soviet tech, pretty much. And we have some newer ship, but a lot of them are old Cold War style destroyers and cruisers. Just seems the
Well,
navies have been neglected.
so there's two things, right? The development of weapons technology over the past 30 or 40 years since the Cold War has been exponential in terms of like detection. Most of where everybody has been placing their resources in is in increased usage of sensors and increased accuracy and effectiveness of sensors. So, like making your ASW uh, uh, like uh, passive towed array systems like more sensitive, or making the your hole mounted sonar better, or making your radars like better, um, or giving your ships the ability to have cooperative engagement or CEC, right? To have the ability to share targeting data, that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, that's really where most of and of course the Chinese like famously have their long range, high frequency radar system, so they can get an idea of where a fleet is. And all of these sensors just make surface ships very expendable, right? If you consider like all of the major surface fleet that we have today, which is Arleigh Burke's and Ticonderoga class cruisers. The Ticonderoga class cruisers, they're old, and they just don't have the ability to maintain those platforms like they to the lifespan that they wanted to. Just because they've ridden them hard for 20 years, deploying them to the Persian Gulf, but they they really so the Tiger class is going away, but like if you look at the tonnage, the Tycho class is like almost 10,000 tons. It's like 9,800, 9,700 tons, right? Same thing with Arleigh Burke, right? So they're almost 10,000 tons. Well, if you consider that a pocket battleship that the Germans made under the naval treaties in the 1920s are usually around 500 feet, almost 600 feet long, and are 60 feet of beam, 100 feet of beam, or whatever it is, and about 10,000 tons. Well, it's basically comparable to what we have now. So, like, people don't understand that. Oh, well, just because all of the equipment has transitioned into electronics, instead of like big gun turrets and that sort of thing, like it was 100 80 years ago. um, yeah, these ships there is a tendency towards gigantism, and one of the big problems that the US Navy has really messed up is the transition out of using the old Oliver Hazard Perry class frigate, um, and into something else, right? The LCS class has been just a complete flub from what everybody has said, and of course you can see they just laid and completed the last one in the series, I think, that they're building, um, and that's it. They're not building anymore because they realize that they're just garbage, and they're already starting to plan to phase those out, and they're creating a new program called the FFG 62, which is going to be basically a new replacement frigate for the LCS, because LCS is just was a terrible idea from the very beginning. Yeah.
Now, responding to Kingdom of Vinland, the scrapping of USS Enterprise CV6 was the tantamount to heresy. Yes, I agree, it was. Absolute. The only ship to win, for what the distinguished degree is, but like a ship that won a battle, there's the word for that like 4 times. I believe it's the only ship ever to earn that distinction. And the amount of times Enterprise was the only carrier we had is astonishing. Just how many
Mm.
times it was the only thing we had. And it could have been destroyed quite easily a couple of times, but it's not the way things worked out. Unfortunately, that's what happens with the Navy. These historical ships get scrapped and destroyed pretty much. But that's why we kind of have some museum ships still. Like Texas is the only dreadnought, if I'm mistaken, dreadnought battleship in existence anymore. So we do have a culture of preserving some of these older ships, but a lot of the great ones have been lost, unfortunately, due to scrapping.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. I have visited USS Iowa, which is an impressive ship. I took a picture of it that um, uh, I have framed, and like these old ships are just incredibly impressive to look at, as in terms of feats of construction. But yeah, let's see. What other questions do we have about military life in general? Hmm. Is there any more like specific questions, like daily routine, things like that?
Yes, this is what we hear a lot about. Why is cleaning your bed and making your bed so important?
Why is cleaning your bed so important?
Clean your room essentially. But this is actually this is a thing. You have to clean your bed pass inspection, otherwise you'll get your shit kicked in, basically.
Yes. Well, it's a cleanliness issue, right? And there, so right there's a lot of these basic disciplinary things that uh, have to be done. And it's the same thing as like blacking your boots or polishing your boots, which you don't even have to polish your boots anymore. You if the instruction says you're just supposed to blacken them on board ship, polishing your boots is a boot camp thing. Um, and it's these little processes and things. They're there for cleanliness. They're there for health and safety. Um, and so why do you have to make your bed in like the Jordan Peterson like clean your room style thing? Well, because this is your space. You live there. You live there with other people. You want your room and the area that you inhabit and live in to be nice and to be clean and to not smell like ass. So that's why.
That seems basic, but unfortunately, decline has made most of this like non-basic. I mean, when you look at most young people, can't really tie their shoes or manage anything competently. So instilling some of these basic discipline values with sound common sense is actually necessary because most people don't have them. Which is a good thing the military does. Unfortunately, it also comes with a lot of libtard baggage now, which sucks.
Mm.
With all these new woke seminars that you have to attend to. I believe also in the swearing-in ceremony, you swear in to defend diversity, equity, and inclusion as well now. So it seems like they very much dishonored that with this garbage, but that's what you got to do to maintain loyalty among the troops. It was actually very funny because I remember you made a video about what's that guy's name? He did a video about that revolution that tried to topple Tsar. Was it Alexander the First or was it
Mm.
Alexander the Second? It was kind of
Yeah.
interesting, right? About how you have a successful revolution, a topple elites.
Or are
Was it
you talking about the Decembrist revolt?
Yes, yes, yes. That one.
Yeah, I did a Substack article and I recorded that to my YouTube channel. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen that, but that's basically my take on it. Yeah, that's interesting. But I think we should probably keep the stream on topic here.
Yes, yes.
So
So why is the Navy gay? We're just going to get to the most important question.
why
Why
is
is
the
it?
Navy why is the gay? Because the Navy as a service is probably other than just the usual har memes. Oh, you're all squids and rum sodomy and the lash stuff. The Navy and um, like I mentioned before, the physical fitness standards are lower, so it's easier to get in. It's easier to get women in. It's easier to get in men who are not like
Overweight.
yeah, who are overweight, who are not, who are there's no height requirement, so you don't need like a guy who's minimum 5'9" or something to be an infantryman. You don't need that. You need, there's a lot of the requirements for the Navy to actually go into the service are simply just less, frankly, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. Um, but it's just it is what it is, right? And the Navy specifically um, has like it's a lot more cerebral in the way that naval warfare is supposed to work, right? It's a lot of electronics. Now it's not like your grandpa's Navy where it's um, fuel and oil and machinery and steam power and everything is in engineering, right? It's not the same, right? It's not less. It's much more electronic and less hardware, if that makes sense. And I mean hardware as like guns and like engineering equipment and stuff like that. So, and like just to be very clear, like the actual propulsion for most of the destroyers and the crew des is gas turbine engine, right? It's not steam anymore, right? So the idea of like the hard man engineer type who has like a pot belly and a mustache and a coffee cup in his hand at all times, right? That like that probably as a like naval stereotype existed like maybe 35 years ago, and if you talk to like some old salts today who are probably about to get out or who just got out, they would probably be able to tell you stories of that kind of like chief who was in the Navy, right? um yeah. Shoot, what was that movie about the Navy diver? I forget the name of that movie now, but I have seen it. Oh shoot, with what was his face? Let me look it up. Like, but yeah, that movie has kind of, um, oh yeah, the one with Cuba Gooding. Yeah, Men of Honor. That's it, right? Yeah, yeah. That sort of like meme with this sort of like Robert De Niro character, this extremely like salty chief who's willing to like, you know, tell the man to go fuck himself. Like that's kind of gone, right? You know, that's just been gone for a while.
Yeah, now you have what I like to call we like to call the biolenist or the underworld types, who are just flooding into boot camp, and that's basically the vast majority of recruits now, which is kind of terrifying. These people are gonna be piloting these $1 billion destroyers with our weapons, and most of them look like they can't even run up a flight of stairs without being out of breath.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you know how modern warfare is conducted is chat wars, right? So it's literally a dude who is sitting in a chair, who's looking at a screen or multiple screens, and who is like, "Oh, I have this, you know, encrypted chat which I'm sending to other ships in my formation, and if I want clarification of something, or if I want to tell them something like." You know, on the download, they tell them through like, you know, chat basically. So it's really funny how like it's the formal communications where you think like, you know, fleet tac communications where you'd be like, you know, Bravo, Niner, 7, India, blah, blah, like that sort of style communication, which you would probably have seen in movies or something, like it is less accurate. Like that's a very anachronistic view.
Speaking of phenotypes in the Navy, what are your thoughts about the submarines? Because I've heard a lot of interesting things about them. That's a very
Ah,
weird type that's drawn to that field, where you basically live
yes.
as a bat for like 6 months.
Submariners are a breed apart. They are weird people.
What
That's
would you
all.
describe the average one like?
Um, I mean, they're as far as the enlisted guys go. I mean, they're not that much different than surface siders. Um, like they might be a little bit more. I don't want to say disciplined. I would say like they just kind of are like don't really care about being underwater and being out of the sunshine. So I would imagine that they probably draw a more like a slightly more World of Warcrafty type of kid who join up that area. Somebody who like I mean every single it's funny right every single service or every single like it's really weird to see even in the military you have like racial segregation in job specialty and there's very clear reasons for this. Like generally speaking, um, in terms of like damage control, engineering, you will see a like you'll see a mix, a smattering of white guys, but a lot of them you'll see occasional black dudes. You'll see some Hispanics. You'll see a lot of, or you'll see Hispanics more commonly in like maybe operations department or like sometimes in as bosun mates. Um, yeah, and but it's much more common to see like you know electronics or anything that requires some kind of security clearance. You'll see white dudes predominate in like the higher skill set, higher IQ enlisted specialties for sure. And yeah, that's the interesting thing. So like Filipinos there's a notorious Filipino mafia um, in engineering and in logistics departments because they can sign up, they can come straight from the Philippines if they want, and they can get into those departments without needing like a top secret clearance, basically.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, but that kind of makes sense since they are kind of one of our former client states.
Hmm. Yeah, and typically, like, you'll see people who are foreigners go into those two departments as well. Like, yeah, a lot of people who are immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa. I've even seen he was kind of an older guy. He was a master chief, but I even knew a guy who was a Russian who was in engineering department, and yeah, that's um, that's also kind of an anachronistic example, but you can tell the kind of person that seems to be drawn to these different job specialties just because of the bureaucratic requirements.
Do you have any funny stories serving? Did you serve on shore or on ship most of the time?
On ship, yeah.
Do you have any
Uh,
like fun stories of
uh, Too many. Where to even begin? Oh shoot, I'm trying to think of which one's the best one. I mean, like, military life is just filled with funny stories, even from basic training. Like, I tell people that Full Metal Jacket, even though it's anachronistic, it's Marine Corps specific, and that culture, as far as I can tell, it is changing slowly, probably slower than other services, but it is still retains a lot of the culture residually. That it used to have, because it's still, like, overwhelmingly white, still extremely masculine, and even Jonathan Bowden mentioned this, right? The Marine Corps, the ideology of the Marine Corps is used to defend liberal democracy, um, and the um, uh, remind me of what your question was again. I'm totally blanking. Oh, funny stories,
funny
right?
stories? Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, oh yes, Full Metal Jacket. Yeah. So literally, when I was in basic training, the um, I'm thinking this. So, the scene in Full Metal Jacket where what's his face has a jelly donut.
A private pile, yeah.
Private Pile. Yes, you know that scene. Yes.
Yes.
Well, that happened. Let's just say that there's because they want you, for whatever reason, they had us go to the local necks, and of course it was kind of an honor system. To get, like, deodorant and shower and crap and stuff like that, right? And basic, if you need uniform items, that's where you have to go there. So people just stop there while they're waiting to get fitted for uniforms. Um, that was just specific to that training center. But yeah, so somebody in, not in my company, but in sister company, decided that it was a great idea to get some Jolly Ranchers. And because you're not allowed to have either caffeine or sweets until, like, you actually graduate, and they let you wear your khakis around and that sort of thing. Or you're getting close to graduation, so you're not allowed to have sweets. You're not allowed to have candy for, like, for 9 weeks, basically. And somebody in, like, week 7 or week 8 decided that it was a great idea to eat some Jolly Ranchers, and then to just throw them in the trash, or not keep them in a self-sealed, opaque container, that couldn't be easily tell, or couldn't, wouldn't lock them in their bed locker or something. Um, yeah, and some of the RDCs and drill instructors found it, And of course, you might classify this as decline, right? Because they're only allowed to to RPTU, which is remedial physical training you, for the 10 minutes. And um, I'm sure really old salts would be like, well, back in my day, they would just beat you until you couldn't be beat no more. But anyway, so like you knew it was bad when they would beat you for the full 10 minutes. Well, this actually happened, and you're sitting in the opposite P way, and you're hearing like, everybody out, and they're just getting put on their face and getting beat to hell, and it's hilarious in hindsight.
That's funny. It's of course it's one of these like subhumans. These violinist types, and they can't even like hide their trash well at all. Didn't even think that far ahead.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's another story too. Oh, I'm remembering, I'm going to start reminiscing here. There's one where there was a guy who I was in a stateroom with, and he was the gunnery officer. And this dude was just a busy dude. Like, he was big, 6 foot tall, blonde hair, um, total jock mentality, right? And said, he basically went on leave, right, for over a palm period, which is, pre-overseas movement. And it's basically every, before, when the ships deploy every year, they give you like a month, basically, where half of the ship goes on gets 2 weeks of leave, and then they rotate it, and the other half gets another 2 weeks of leave. And so what happens? This guy goes on leave, but he doesn't do his laundry, and so like he was a nasty guy, right? And he was an academy guy, of course. An academy, there's memes about academy guys because they're stereotyped as ring knockers, right? Because they have an academy ring that they all wear, and they knock on doors and things with their ring. It's kind of obnoxious, but academy guys are like. The junior enlisted types can tell what kind of officer they're dealing with just by demeanor. So like they very clearly can identify, like, by stereotype, like, oh, this guy was OCS, this guy was an academy grad. And academy grads are either like shit hot, they're everything that they have is just totally squared away. They love the Navy life, they love the discipline, they love everything about it, they love the long work hours. And these are the types of people who are going to make admiral, right? And then you have the other types who are complete shitbags and complete dirtbags, um, and who just they went through the academy, and they didn't enjoy it, and so they kind of let loose when they get out into the fleet at the first opportunity. um, but so this guy, he goes on leave, and he goes to the gym a lot because he wanted to be a Navy SEAL. Like, he wanted to lateral transfer into the SEALs. And so he left his dirty, like, NWUs, his Navy working uniform, for those who don't know the acronym, and his dirty, like, gym clothes and underwear in a laundry bag over this palm period. And I was just sitting there with another officer, another ensign, who in the state, when we're like, dude, that fucking smells so gross. Let's just fucking wash it. Like, and so, because it was all contained in a laundry bag already, so we just grabbed this laundry bag, threw it into the laundry, and did the laundry, folded it onto his bed, and we I'm just thinking about this. This is so funny. I printed out a bunch of sheets with the why you know meme, and so we printed out Gunno why you know wash clothes, and like taped all of this like inside of his bunk. So when he comes back from Palm, he just like freaks, he flips his shit and just starts freaking out, like, who the fuck touched my clothes? And I just, oh my god, it was so funny.
Judging by your accent, I could tell what this guy looks like, and I never even met him.
Oh man. I mean, yeah, but he was an academy grad. He was a good dude, and he worked really hard, but man, he was like, god, those people, that group of officers was very dirty.
What do you guys call the donut people who just like who eat donuts and are fat, and yet they're still like mid-level managers? What are those people called?
I mean, um, pot bellies. I don't know. Like, that's a really specific one. It's hard because like, um, you see it more often where somebody who goes on deployment, who is eating 3 square meals a day and just whatever, and never exercises on the ship, and they get fat, right? It's a very easy onboard ship either to lose weight because of stress and having a very routine eating schedule, or it's very easy to gain weight if you're somebody who's always running to the ship store and eating, the ghee dunk, right? Which is a slang term for,
The goy slop you get.
it's not it's well, ghee dunk is a specific term. It's not goy slop. It's called ghee dunk because you have vending machines on board ship, and it's kind of an anachronism too, because you have the ship store where everything's electronic and you have like an actual dude who comes and do that, but they still do have vending machines on board the ship, so people can, after hours, they love to get Monster Energy drinks. Like, God, like the enlisted side of the Navy and the military in general just runs off of like Red Bull and Monster Energy. um, and of course, the O clubs are like hoity-toity. So like somebody will invest in like an espresso machine for deployment or some bullshit. But yeah, um, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just that's what ghee dunk is, and so it's very easy for somebody to get fat if you're not careful.
Just from the documentaries I've seen, they're all fat. Like almost everyone is. There's either two body types, honestly. There's like no in between. It's either you're really fat or you're like meth skinny. Like that's it. There's no in between, pretty much. With exceptions, but that's the majority. It feels like.
Yeah, you'll occasionally see some very enterprising, like gunner's mate type, or somebody who is like a super fitness bro. But most of the time, yeah, you're pretty much right. You get two types of people, and it's much more common to see like super fat bodies. Like, occasionally, you'll see them in other rates, but most of the time, you'll see them in like engineering or some weird place. But yeah, a lot of them are just fat.
Interesting question from Vinland. Did you ever meet any fighter pilots during your time in the Navy?
It was fighter pilots, like FA-18 pilots. I probably did at some point. I can't remember any of their names. I was more common. It's more common on crew des platforms, which is what I served on. To meet helicopter pilots, specifically MH-60 pilots. Um, yeah, MH-60 Romeos, to be very specific. Occasionally, you'll have Sierras land, but it's much more common for crew des platforms to work with the MH-60 Romeo, because the MH-60 Romeo is there for SUW and ASW purposes, and the Sierra is there for search and rescue and like personnel transfers and stuff.
So we gotta ask, because this is a time-honored tradition with ships, but is there a ship specifically that you, like, just has the reputation of having the worst luck that nobody wants to be assigned to, and then if you get assigned to, it's the worst thing? And then there's a ship that's like the newest and the best. And it's got all of the new stuff.
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I would say that ships, generally speaking, get a reputation. That is absolutely true, and it is kind of a naval superstition not to name ships after women. Historically, that's considered, or it used to be considered, bad luck. Of course, now we're just doing that willy nilly. But the and that's just how it shows you the cultural change that we've undergone. But yeah, the most famous example that I can think of is the USS Cowpens, which has a horrific reputation for a lot of reasons. Um, which, if anybody's not familiar, the Cowpens a couple years ago. This was like a while back. This was like a decade or almost a decade and a half ago now. But the CEO of the Cowpens, they went on deployment. He got what was it? He got sick. So he was basically like still the captain, but he was like kind of missing in action the whole deployment in his stateroom. And so the XO, something happened to the XO, so the XO was not present. The chief engineer, who was a female, who was married, and of course the captain was always married. She so typically in seniority, because the chief engineer, just this is just the way it works. They always make the chief engineer the third in line for command, to take charge in case the captain of the XO get killed. And that's just because of like the way that seniority usually works. And so the um, um, the chief engineer was sleeping with the captain basically, and they were both married. And this, so essentially, like you have this entire deployment where and the Cowpens didn't have a really stellar reputation beforehand. Like they had previous issues, but this was like everybody was. This is so far debased. You're like, what the hell, man? Like you go on deployment, you start like fucking your chief engineer. They both get fired basically. Yeah, it was bad. It was really bad. It was just a hugely bad incident.
Are you aware of the USS Porter, like the ship that almost like three times like sunk itself and other ships around it? And I believe it almost killed FDR, which is a really cool fact because it like
Oh, I
fired
mean,
torpedoes at the ship or
I
whatever.
I know the USS Porter, the modern one. I didn't know about the World War II one.
No, I
That's
just know it
interesting.
because it almost killed him, which would have been. I'm not going to
Interesting.
go there, but quite interesting all lore if that did happen. Apparently, it almost killed people three times. But
I
there's
mean,
just something
there's
about ships though. Like some of them seem to absorb all the luck, right? And some of them
yeah,
just like get shit and none.
yeah. Like it's interesting. Like specifically, there's another ship which kind of had, at least without I was aware of, the USS Dewey, which kind of had a bad reputation when I was in. It was called the Dirty Dewey, who also, by the way, at the time had a female CO. Yeah, eh, it's a leadership issue, and there are ships that have bad reputations, and they kind of you get in a bad situation, and then the you do get in a very this the tempo, the op tempo doesn't slack off at all, and so you get a changeover in personnel, you get a changeover in command, and it's still the ship is just so fucked up that it just it's very difficult to recover, right? um it's very difficult to recover. um
Actually,
so
Vinland, I was going to bring up that example of the Russian aircraft carrier Kamchatka. I think that's what it is. Are you aware of the story of Russia's only aircraft carrier?
I mean, I'm familiar that it has kind of a bad reputation. That's all I'm familiar with. But
So
yeah,
apparently, this ship is caught on fire multiple times.
I mean, our ships catch on fire multiple times. Like the George Washington caught on fire a while ago. Um, it's not. Oh, this is back to the cleanliness issue. That's one reason why cleanliness is such a big deal. In addition to like you don't want ship-borne diseases to start spreading. Like you think about, oh, if the flu goes around, everybody's going to get sick, right? Because you're all in a closed environment, you're all breathing recirculated air. Well, there's other issues too, which is dust accumulation, right? If you have dust that accumulates naturally in the ventilation ducts, and dust that accumulates naturally just because dust is dust and you get dust bunnies everywhere, well, dust catches fire up really easily, right? Dryer lint is an incredible way to start fires, and so dust is a huge danger on board ship for that reason, because it will start a class alpha fire, and you don't want fire on board a ship where every 50 feet you're within fuel or ammunition.
Also, going back to ships that seem to get the luck. Are you aware of like the ship, like one ship of its like class seems to absorb all the luck, right? You see, this is more
A
observable in older
class.
ship, like one ship of like for example, the Blucher heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper class. All the ships sunk except for Prince Eugen, and so they say that like one ship seems to absorb the luck, or like the Scharnhorst class. Where Scharnhorst seems to survive for most of the war except for its end. But it seems to be an interesting fact that one ship of its class seems to get all of the luck, and others get none.
Hmm.
It's quite a distinct thing.
That's interesting. I mean, you can kind of see a similar deal too with like older ships. It's probably more common with older ships because modern ships, their life cycle, they don't sink, they don't get sunk. Like you could see this with Titanic, because if I remember correctly, um, I think all of them sank except for the Olympic, which is one of the three sister ships, because Britannic hit a mine in World War One, if memory serves.
Yes.
The Titanic sank from an iceberg, and then Olympic kept trucking along, into and through the Second World War as a transport ship. Um, so yeah, the that's an interesting observation. Yeah, I don't. I mean, also because the ship classes are just bigger these days, right? When you're talking about Arleigh Burke, you have like dozens of these ships that are built in the same class. If we went back to like what the Chinese and the Russians do, which is to build a single class of ships with like two or three of them at a time, just to test out how the platform works, and then make um, changes, which is probably a sound decision, right? Naval technology changes so rapidly, and especially with electronics, that's probably what we should be doing instead of building like just pumping out massive production runs of the same class. I mean, I'm not trying to say that like Arleigh Burkes are the same, because they're not. They have like different flights of them in between the Arleigh Burke DDGs. Like you have Flight 1, Flight 2, Flight 3, for example, which all have minor capability differences and design differences. But yeah, but I think that if you return to that style of model where you have, okay, a couple ships here, a couple ships there, and all these different like classes that get updated in two or three ships, like with what the U.S. Navy did with the old battleships, right? With they built two of them. I'm sure you'd probably see slight distinctions, and in that sort of superstition would come back again as observable reality.
Yeah, they seem to also have personalities as well. Um,
Mm.
Quite famously, the British battleship Warspite was incredibly hard to steer, and when it didn't want to, it didn't want to, just randomly.
Mm.
That's the interesting about ships before like modernity. They seem to have like personalities to them, which is like you can't quantify it, but they seem to have like distinct personalities to them that you could feel.
Mm. Yeah, I can't speak to the ships that I was on for their personalities, but that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, because everything now just is like the gray goo, the most like SUV typed cars, which all look the same basically, with a few minor stereo changes. So everything just feels the same, very monotonous.
Mm. Yeah. Anyway, so raging, or excuse me, Kingdom of Vinland says, "Did the Navy fix the problem of jet fuel leaking into the drinking water?" I don't know. I don't know the status of CAS reps. That's all classified. But or casualty reports. I assume that. Well, let's put it this way: in order to fix that issue, you have to take the ship back into the shipyards, you have to take out. First of all, you have to identify where the leak is, right? So you have to figure out which water tank it's coming from. Once you've isolated where the leak is, because what you have, right, is you have a water tank which is next to a fuel tank, and they're separated by a barrier, right, a steel barrier. Well, obviously that barrier wall has corroded, and so you need to go in, take all of the fuel out of the one tank and all the water out of the other tank. You need to gas free these spaces, right? Because in order to go into these spaces in the shipyards, you have to make sure that there like any like empty space or tank or void. You have to make sure that there's no like residual toxic gases. You have to make sure it's safe to go into, right? Okay, so you have to open it up. You have to send a dude into the crawl space into this tank. He's got to find out where the rust, the corrosion is, which, if he's got a flashlight, should be easy. But then he has to take some sort of do corrosion control. So he's got and this is one reason why you have to gas free the space, right? Because that's jet fuel. So you have to make sure there's no fuel vapor, no residual fuel at all whatsoever, because he's going to have to go in there and take either a needle gun, or he's going to have to take a angle grinder or some sort of cutting wheel, and get all of this corrosion off of that, right? Because you're going to have to go in there, take all of this corrosion out. You have to bring in another steel plate or series of steel plates, and then you have to weld them to fix the actual puncture between these two fuel tanks, because obviously there's some kind of rupture there. And then, of course, you have to, repaint it or resurface it after you've done that. Yeah. So it's intensive. I don't know whether they've done that yet, because I don't know what their yard schedule is like, unfortunately. But that's just so you get an idea of what has to be done in order to do that. That's a kind of an intensive process, right? And you can only do that until you go back into the shipyards. The problem with the carriers, which is a tangential problem of this, is the carriers are very, very old, right? They're nearing the end of their life cycle. Most of them are 25 years old. They have gone through their mid-life cycle refueling, most of them, for their nuclear fuel. So they're on the second half of their life cycle. And as anybody will tell you, the older a ship gets, the more maintenance intensive it becomes because of corrosion. The less freely available spare parts are, because a lot of these contracts that the Navy makes for these ships are like 50 years old, right? And that's probably especially true in electronics equipment. So yeah, so these ships are just old, and the older a ship gets, the more difficult it becomes to maintain, and the more costly it becomes to maintain.
And that's actually why we're seeing them when they get to the end of their lifespan, they turn them into artificial reefs. You see some of them, like they did to the USS America. And
or targets, yeah, they use them for naval gunnery targets. Which, if you want to see how effective naval gunnery is, or how effective a modern Mark 46 or Mark 48 torpedo, or even Mark 54 torpedo is, go check that out. Yeah.
Yeah, it go boom, which is quite fun to watch.
It go very boom, yes.
But do you guys have a service rifle that you still use in ceremonies? What's your main service rifle? Is the standard U.S. military M4?
No, it's the M16.
Okay,
it's the M16. The M4 does get used occasionally. You can. This is more of a distinct difference, but for force protection purposes, you can. The M4 and the M16 are they're almost the same. They're basically the same rifle. There's a slight difference in the max effective range, if I remember correctly, but it's not it's so minor. Like they're basically interchangeable, and a lot of the enlisted guys, if they're serving topside rover, because the M4, you can collapse the stock on it, so you can make it a little more portable. They like it because it's less cumbersome, so you can move through ships and the space in between the ship a little easier because you can collapse that stock. And you can also it's lighter, right? So when you're standing for 5 hours of watch, they prefer to have that one because it's not as heavy, and you're already wearing a duty belt with a service pistol, usually or used to be an M9. It's probably the newer version now, the new SIG version now. But yes, you're wearing a service pistol with all the ammo, and you're wearing a bulletproof duty vest with like armor plates that can stop a 7.62 round. So I mean, it's just and a helmet, so it's very heavy, right?
It sounds heavy, but it sounds like a good workout. The way to stay fit as
Yeah,
you walk around the ship. But this is an interesting question I've had. So, are you actually allowed to, in the middle of the sea that's calm? Are you allowed to like swim in the sea? Because we've seen videos of people
yeah.
jump off aircraft carriers.
That's usually a swim call. It doesn't have to happen very often, but it does happen. Um, which is why it's kind of a special event, and why people take pictures of it, and why you probably see it, because, oh, hey, we did a swim call, yay, it was so much fun. um, yeah, so that does happen occasionally. So
Yeah, it
I've
does
never
seem
done
like
it
there is
myself,
some
but
risk to that with sharks, but quite
yeah, they do.
famously.
They do set up a shark watch before they do that. Yeah, so that they'll have a guy with a M16, or yeah, who's doing Overwatch.
Fun fact about sharks: the deadliest shark attack was actually USS Indianapolis.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
But that's
I
just what happens.
I mean, I've read the accounts of like the Juno, when the USS Juno sank, due to a torpedo attack, and then those guys, like, they got eaten up by sharks pretty bad too. The accounts of that is just terrible. But yeah.
Sounds like a horrible way to die. Uh,
Oh yeah, just because, especially if you're like, oh, it's my turn to get in the water now. Oh dang it, the sharks are already know we're here, and they know we're food. So, but yeah.
but you probably actually die from dehydration first. That's a big thing, especially cold too. I don't know if you've ever heard about the Battle of North Cape, right? Uh, where the German battleship, we'll use that term, Scharnhorst, was basically cornered by a British task force, um, and sank in an Arctic storm. It capsized. So
Mm,
basically, all the men had to leap off into this frozen sea. So they died like almost instantly, which is fairly tragic, except for a few people. But that seems horrible. Like it's just in the middle of a freezing sea where you know death is certain, right?
mm. Yeah,
With
yeah. I mean,
hypothermia.
yeah, hyperthermia is a huge problem for man overboard. And they practice man overboard drills all the time, right? It's a basic ship handling competency. Is just doing a shipboard recovery, which is that's an interesting one, because you have you have rescue swimmers. You usually have two of them on board, and so when you do man overboard drills, it's like the entire ship. And these are famous things, right? These are basic Navy processes, so everybody's probably heard of this, right? You all have to go to man overboard, port side, and the ship, turns and comes about and in a big circle, or a U shape or something, um, and everybody has to go muster. And if you don't get to your space before, the muster sheet gets sent up to the bridge where the XO is counting to make sure to find out who's missing. If you don't get there in time, you have to run up and you have to go, like, sign the muster sheet up in the bridge, which is kind of an embarrassing thing, because you have to go in front of the XO and be like, oh yeah, I didn't make it in time to sign the muster sheet. Oh, I didn't hear the word passed or something because I was asleep, right? Which that has happened before, by the way, where you do a man overboard drill, and like two people are missing, and you're like, wait, hold on. Because if you normally, what happens for man overboard drills is the XO will find some random person, and the XO will be like, you're coming with me to my office, and you're going to sit in my stateroom for the next like hour or two. So
Yeah, we're gonna ground you for my drill to show everybody what you're supposed to do.
mhm. Yeah,
Kids.
yeah. And you're supposed to be able to recover the man in a certain period of time, depending on what the water temperature is. So yeah, if it's cold, like you could have as little as like 8 minutes or something. So it becomes very difficult. And obviously, if you do man overboard, it's a lot easier to recover somebody with like the ship's boat, or if you have an aircraft, right? That's easier to do too, because it's just very simple to deploy a SAR swimmer from an aircraft, or to just grab a dude and haul him into a rib.
So this is an interesting question, but famously throughout history, a lot of warships have been sunk by their own ammunition detonating. Why do you think? Obviously, in modern improvements, technology has kind of limited that, but it still does happen. Accidental detonations, right, of the main magazine. But what do you think was the main thing that kind of stopped that from happening? That being an issue, besides us moving away
Um,
from like turrets in ship
yeah,
combat.
I mean, yeah, turrets is a big deal. Um, in modern warfare, so the thing you got to understand is the changes in missile technology, right? So you're not really, and especially because with naval gunnery, right? And of course, even in World War II, you still see ammo detonations. Famously, there was one at Pearl Harbor for a DD. I forget which one, but it's a famous
Arizona.
picture of. Oh no, it wasn't Arizona. It was a destroyer. It was a destroyer. It wasn't actually Arizona that had its ammo detonate. But yeah, there's a famous picture of a destroyer which detonated in Pearl Harbor, and um, yeah, so it's not impossible for a torpedo to do it, but just the way that modern torpedoes work is they don't actually make direct contact with the hull. What they do is they create an air bubble underneath the hull, and the differential in pressure that is very sudden is what cracks the keel of the hull, right? Um, so it's not designed to explode and to blow up with direct contact with the ship. It's there to explode like next underneath or next to the ship, right, and cause damage that way. The other issue is missile technology. Missile technology has changed substantially, and it has to do with a lot of sensors. You'll find, because of what, like, even with missiles that uh, are typically, your basic sea skimming active seeker missiles, which are just looking for the ship's radar signature. The biggest radar signature that missile is going to see is the superstructure, right? It's and yeah, probably also some of the hull, but it's not going to hit like deep beneath the waterline where an ammunition magazine is, at least for the 5-inch gun, is going to be. Um, Maybe, and of course, you have to also understand that a VLS cell, every single missile in a VLS cell is like self-contained in a box, right? It has its own, like, every single missile. It doesn't get loaded in as a missile. The missiles come in little boxes that you insert into the VLS cell when you do like ammunition transfers and that sort of thing. So it's not like, oh, it's a missile that's just lying in a storage bin, like 5-inch guns, or old naval gunnery shells, right? Um,
Yeah,
so
quite famously because with the Moskva, I believe it was a harpoon missile, right? They
no, it
got
was
through.
it wasn't a harpoon missile. It was a Ukrainian homebrew version of an old Soviet missile. But it was very similar to Harpoon. It is an active seeker missile, which is subsonic, and it has like a roughly 300 kilogram, it's a 400 kilogram warhead. So it's like I keep saying, it's like Harpoon. There's a lot of missiles that are very, very similar in capability to Harpoon, and Harpoon is very much showing its age. But like, missiles are like bullets, right? And you're going to shoot your least capable missiles first.
Yeah, try to wear down the air defense.
Yeah,
So you get an opening.
which is why missiles like like missiles like a lot of the older Chinese ones that are less capable, like even the Silkworm is still kind of considered somewhat dangerous, even though it's really slow, because well it has just this massive warhead, right? And of course the more like YJ-83, Charlie 803 types, those missiles are also very plentiful, and everybody can get their hands on them because they're relatively inexpensive. Unlike the old Soviet carrier killer missiles like SSN 27 or the SSN 22 or any of those old ones. Those ones are like they still are very fearsome, but it's a difference in targeting, right? Whereas if you also consider like arcing shots, like famously the debate over what sank the Bismarck, if I remember, no, not the Bismarck, it was
Oh,
the
Hood,
HMS Hood,
Hood.
the HMS Hood, because the HMS Hood and her sister ship that were steaming in formation um, was a battle cruiser, and so the decking on a battle cruiser to meet the tonnage requirements and to keep the ship faster than a normal battleship, they reduced like the weight. And how do you reduce weight? Well, you reduce armor. And where do they take the armor? Well, they reduce the armor from the top of the ship, right? The deck plating. And so it becomes a lot easier to fire a shell that arcs and comes down on top of the ship, and penetrates that way. So that's also one of the reasons why you probably don't see ammo detonations like you used to in old school naval warfare as much, because right now you're like you also have to think about the amount of explosive material in a 14-inch or a 16-inch gun, and compare that to a missile who has like on the lower end. Most missiles are not as don't have as big of an explosive warhead as a Silkworm. They have more like comparable to Harpoon, like about 300 kilograms or something like that, right? And what they're designed to do is they're not designed to sink a ship. They're designed to achieve what's called a mission kill. Like I'm trying to blow up your radar system, or I'm trying to blow up um, your electronic suite, your ability to have these data inputs like all go into your main computer mainframe and come out on a data on its tactile display in CIC, right, Combat Information Center. Like all of that stuff is what those missiles are really designed to do. Is they're designed to achieve some sort of mission kill where I'm getting rid of your crucial capability to either detect or to transfer that detection data to other ships.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because we saw in Moscow, it looks like it was a fire that kind of ultimately weakened and sunk that ship. But
Well, I mean, yeah, we've talked about Moscow before, but Moscow really, it definitely was showing its age, right? Because I've talked about the difference between, because it's even like 50 years old, like it's a pre-Aegis warship platform, and so it doesn't even have like a fixed array radar like a spy radar. It has a circle search radar, which I mean, technically, the American military still uses circle search radars. Like some cruisers have like SPS 48 or no SPS 49, which is like a backup for spy. Most of them don't. It's just some of them that still do. But the carriers famously used it, and the like LHA LHD platforms still use the SPS 48 because yeah, that's what was available at the time, and it's a little bit cheaper, if I remember correctly, than Spy, but it does have very significant um, uh, weaknesses as compared to like a radar that has like three panels, right? That gives you 360-degree coverage at all times, right? Because it's very much in the old school, like, if you imagine, like, a movie about a World War II ship, and you see a radar, and you see the radar, or the Cold War, I should say, a movie about the Cold War, and you see there's like a green line that circles around, and on the radar display, and you get like a little blip, right? That's what that old style of radar actually does, and it's very much weak because missiles, especially the supersonic ones, just move so quick. So like if you have an old school radar and it drops track for a half a second, like, okay, well, you're shooting your air defense missile at something that is like, significantly further along its flight path than where you detected it. So yeah, I mean, Moskva was had just aging platform. That's all.
And don't get me wrong, but as ships age, doesn't the metal kind of weaken over time? Is that still a thing that happens?
Yeah, corrosion is the thing for sure. And you can um, when metal corrodes, right? It oxidizes, and it becomes heavier, so it becomes a stability concern. Because as it takes on oxygen molecules, it becomes more, heavier and more dense, and it flakes off. But it means that you have to do corrosion control. So all of the corroding metal that's on a deck plate or in a bulkhead or on an angle iron or something, all of that stuff needs to be stripped off and resurfaced and repainted and all of that. So
Well, quite cool, quite cool. So what happens to be your favorite naval battle that is you like studying or think is interesting?
which one is my favorite? Hmm, Probably the Falklands battle is the one that I recommend to everybody, because it is the one that is probably closest to how modern naval technology works. A lot of the aircraft and the warships that were used in that conflict kind of still are around. Like there's still F4s and F5s that are still floating around. Um, and famously, the Argentinians used their F4s and F5s as if they were missiles. So they strapped conventional bombs on these jet aircraft, and they darted them below, like right above sea level, and then popped up at the last second to drop their bombs. Very similar to how a lot of the older missiles function in terms of their flight path. So that's one thing they do. Um, the interesting thing um, about that in terms of its tactics is like the Argentinians didn't have a lot of missiles. Like they had a couple of Exocet missiles, and like the Exocet is of the same era as Harpoon. It's not quite as good as Harpoon is, for various reasons, but it's still like a very effective missile, especially for in the early to mid '80s. It was a weapon that was considered top of the line. And so like they only had a couple of them, so they had to make do with regular Air Force weapons, regular Air Force planes dropping conventional bombs. And it's interesting because there's a lot to be said about the Falklands as well, in terms of how little ordnance actually detonated. Like both, and this is still like a very early period of missile warfare, and the missiles are still, especially the air defense missiles, are still relatively primitive compared to today. So like you have the British would their air defense missiles just wouldn't go off, or they wouldn't launch, or like the Argentinian like bombs that they dropped just wouldn't explode. Um, is very very interesting in that regard, because there were a lot of shortcuts that the British took in order to get down to the Falklands on time. Like they were they were not ready to go to war. at that point. And either way, like both sides could have conceivably won that. Like especially if the Argentinians had used the exocets at a more critical time, or against the actual carrier that the British were running. Um, yeah. So yeah, the other book I always recommend is the 100 Days of War, which is the memoir written by the Falklands Battle Group commander, Admiral Sandy Woodward. Yeah, I've read that. That's a good one too. If you want to understand what modern missile warfare and what modern ship warfare looks like, that's the source that I would go to.
If you want to know what possible Taiwan situation would look like.
No, I mean no, seriously. Like, yeah, it's an excellent resource. I mean, because everybody's conception, and this is a huge problem among the general public. Everybody's conception of what warfare is like, and especially naval warfare with planes, is very much World War II centric. And right now, with the effectiveness of air defense and missiles, like planes are almost like a backseat. So the national strategy of the American empire is to invest in its carrier fleet. And of course, in doing investments in its carrier fleet, it invests in Aegis. It is as a all-encompassing way to accumulate warfare data from all of these radar inputs, all of these sensor inputs, to get an accurate battle picture. And it uses Aegis and Spy specifically a um, as a way of being able to defend against enemy missile attacks. Like the Soviets didn't focus on carriers; they focused on like weapons platforms with like one or two or a couple highly capable like anti-ship cruise missiles. But the United States focused on carrier platforms and air defense. So you have this really weird situation in terms of warfare where the United States is choosing defense of its carrier assets and defense against missiles, but the enemy forces or the Op 4 forces are choosing to invest in greater numbers and more accurate missiles. So it's very much in the old school style of warfare, the weapon versus the armor that it's trying to defeat, and vice versa. So yeah, it's fascinating to watch that development. Um, Kingdom of Vinland says the Moskva is another example of Russia not knowing how to do naval stuff. Plus, it's fitting that Ukraine sunk Moskva because they're the ones that built her. Well, yes, the Ukrainians also have a um, interesting reputation as well from the Soviet era in making guided missiles. That was a little tidbit of information that I found on Wikipedia when doing more research into their missile system, the sunk the Moskva. Because apparently I didn't know that at all. So yeah, that's an interesting point of information. So I mean, it kind of fits with your specialty. All right. Any other questions?
I think I answered all the ones I wanted to ask.
Perfect. All right. I think that basically wraps up for today. We're almost at the hour and 45 mark, so we can go ahead and get our shills and get out of here. So go ahead and give your links, please.
Well, you guys can find me on my YouTube channel. It's just called American Elitist. Just check me out there, or if you're interested in me, follow me on Twitter for some base takes.
And of course, I am Raging Manager, or also known as Raging Monkey (RM). You can find me on all the places I mentioned above earlier in the stream: Twitter, here on YouTube, also on my Substack, where I put out articles that are written in case you like. I usually am pretty good about uploading my Substack articles to YouTube. I probably should. There's a couple that I think I'm backlogged and I should probably upload those soon. But yeah, normally I just upload all of my Substack articles to YouTube because some people like to listen instead of read. But if you like to read, go ahead and check out my Substack in case you like prefer to read rather than listen. So yeah, you can find me in all those places as well as at the Old Glory Club. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get out of here. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.